Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartwarming tales of love, resilience, and the power of human connection. Today's story is about an extraordinary journey that begins with a young boy's selfless bravery and leads to the rediscovery of a family's unbreakable bond. From the bustling streets to a quiet farmhouse, this tale is filled with moments of hope, fear, and the enduring strength of love. It's a story that reminds us of the power of compassion and the importance of never giving up on the ones we hold dear. Subscribe to our channel and join us as we dive into today's inspiring story. The sun was setting over the bustling streets of Chicago, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks and red-bricked buildings. The air was thick with the scent of car exhaust and hot pretzels from the street vendors. But for Tyler Morrison, these smells were just a background to his harsh reality. At only 12 years old, Tyler had learned to navigate the streets like a seasoned veteran. His blonde hair was messy, and his clothes were torn, smeared with the grime of countless days spent dodging trouble and searching for scraps of food. He moved quickly, his bare feet stepping deftly over shards of glass and crumpled cans. His blue eyes, once bright and full of innocence, now reflected exhaustion and hunger. He muttered under his breath, his voice soft but resolute. "Today's gotta be better. I can't keep going like this." Tyler's stomach growled, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. He rummaged through a trash can, his small hands sorting through the refuse with practiced efficiency. The rancid smell made him gag, but hunger was stronger than disgust. After a moment, he pulled out a half-eaten sandwich. It was stale and smelled faintly of mayonnaise. But to Tyler, it was a small treasure. He stuffed it into the pocket of his oversized jacket and moved on, keeping his head down to avoid drawing attention. The streets weren't kind to boys like Tyler. He had learned to stay invisible, blending into the background to avoid the angry shopkeepers and cruel strangers who seemed to think street kids were a nuisance. "Hey, get outta here," a man yelled from a nearby store. Waving a broom at him, Tyler flinched and mumbled an apology before scurrying away, his heart pounding. He didn't resent these people, he understood their fear and frustration. But understanding didn't make the rejection any easier to bear. It was just another reminder that he didn't belong, that the world didn't have a place for kids like him. As the crowds thinned, Tyler's sharp eyes caught sight of a man across the street. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the ragged boy standing in the shadows. The man was talking animatedly on his phone, his face tense. Even from a distance, Tyler could sense his frustration. James Harrington was the kind of man Tyler could only dream of becoming: confident, successful, and clearly accustomed to a life of luxury. Tyler watched him for a moment, imagining what it must be like to have clean clothes and a home to return to at night. Maybe someday, he whispered to himself, though his heart wasn't convinced. But something about the man caught Tyler's attention. James was so absorbed in his call that he didn't notice the stoplight change. As he stepped off the curb, a car came speeding toward him, its horn blaring in a futile attempt to warn him of the danger. Time seemed to slow for Tyler. The sound of screeching tires echoed in his ears, and his heart raced as he saw James freeze in fear. Tyler hesitated for only a split second, his survival instincts screaming at him to stay put. But a stronger voice, a voice he hadn't heard in a long time, rose above the fear. "I can't just let him die." Without thinking, Tyler ran toward the man, his feet pounding against the pavement. He threw himself against James with all his strength, pushing him out of the car's path. The impact sent both of them sprawling onto the sidewalk as the car sped past, narrowly missing them. Tyler's arm scraped against the rough ground, but the pain barely registered. James stared at Tyler, stunned. What just happened?" he stammered, his voice shaky. "You almost got hit," Tyler replied, his own voice trembling. "You gotta watch the road." James looked at the boy in disbelief. His suit was rumpled, and there was a tear in his sleeve where Tyler had grabbed him. But the boy in front of him, this small, dirty, barefoot child, had just saved his life. He noticed the scrape on Tyler's arm, the blood trickling down onto his wrist. "You're hurt," he said, his voice softening. Tyler shrugged, brushing it off. "I'm fine. Just be more careful next time." "Okay." James sat up, still trying to process what had happened. He reached out to touch Tyler's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't know how to repay you." Tyler looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "It's nothing. I couldn't let you get hit. That's all." For the first time in a long while, James felt something stir inside him. He had spent years building his career, focusing on stocks and investments, measuring his worth in dollar signs. But this boy, this brave, selfless child, had risked everything for a complete stranger. James didn't know why, but he felt a connection to Tyler, a sense of responsibility that he couldn't explain. As the sound of sirens grew closer, James turned to Tyler again. "What's your name?" "Tyler," the boy replied hesitantly. "I'm James Harrington," he said, extending his hand. Tyler hesitated for a moment before shaking it, his small, calloused hand dwarfed by James's firm grip. "Why'd you do it?" James asked, genuinely curious. "Why risk your life for me?" Tyler looked down at his scraped arm, his voice quiet but resolute. "Because it was the right thing to do." Those words hung in the air, resonating deeply with James. As the paramedics arrived and began checking them over, James couldn't take his eyes off Tyler. There was something about this boy, something that went beyond gratitude or obligation. In that moment, James felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Tyler, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that James was safe, pride in his own bravery, and a deep sadness that came from knowing he would return to the streets as soon as this moment was over. But for now, he allowed himself to bask in the warmth of James's gratitude. However fleeting it might be, neither of them knew it yet, but this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. The flashing lights of the ambulance bathed the scene in red and blue, illuminating the small crowd that had gathered. Tyler shifted uncomfortably under their curious stares. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the idea of paramedics touching his scraped arm made him even more uneasy. "Are you sure you don't want us to look at that?" one of the paramedics asked. Kneeling beside him, Tyler pulled his arm back instinctively, shaking his head. "It's nothing. Really," he insisted, his voice firm despite the sting of the scrape. "Just help him." He gestured toward James, who was seated on the curb, holding his head in his hands. The paramedics turned their attention to James, who seemed shaken but uninjured. Tyler watched as they asked him a series of questions, his answers coming slowly, as though he was still piecing together what had just happened. "You saved his life. You know," one of the paramedics said, glancing at Tyler. "That was a brave thing to do." Tyler didn't respond. Instead, he stared down at his bare feet, scuffed and dirted by years of navigating the unforgiving streets. Brave? Maybe. But it wasn't about bravery for him. It was about doing what was right. Something he wished more people would do for kids like him. James, now standing with the paramedics' support, looked at Tyler. His brown eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were soft with gratitude. "Tyler," he said, his voice steadier now, "I owe you my life. How can I ever repay you?" Tyler looked away, uncomfortable with the question. What could a man like James Harrington, with his expensive suit and polished shoes, possibly do for a boy who lived in alleyways and ate stale bread? He shrugged. "You don't owe me anything," he muttered. James frowned, studying the boy. There was something in Tyler's tone, an undercurrent of loneliness, perhaps even resignation, that tugged at him. He had spent years negotiating million-dollar deals. But this was different. This was a human connection, raw and unfiltered, and he couldn't let it slip away. Where are your parents? James asked, his voice gentle. Tyler's expression hardened. He hated that question. Hated the way it reminded him of everything he didn't have. Don't have any, he replied flatly. It's just me. The words hung in the air, heavier than James had expected. He opened his mouth to say something, but the paramedics interrupted. Sir, we need to take you to the hospital for a thorough checkup, one of them said. You may have a concussion. James nodded. But his focus remained on Tyler. What about him? He asked, gesturing toward the boy. He seems fine, the paramedic replied, clearly eager to move on. James hesitated. Letting Tyler walk away didn't feel right. He turned back to the boy. Tyler, can you come with me? At least to the hospital? Let them take a look at your arm. It's the least I can do. Tyler hesitated. The idea of stepping into an ambulance, of being surrounded by strangers in a sterile, unfamiliar environment, filled him with unease. But James's expression, earnest and insistent, softened his resistance. Okay, he said quietly. The ride to the hospital was quiet at first. Tyler sat stiffly, his eyes darting between the paramedics and James. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, and he didn't know how to respond to it. You're brave. You know, James said, breaking the silence. Tyler shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. I just did what anyone would do. No, James said firmly. Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger. Especially not a kid your age. Tyler glanced at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. There was no pity in James's eyes. Only admiration and something Tyler couldn't quite place. Respect. Maybe. At the hospital. Tyler sat on the edge of an examination table, his scraped arm cleaned and bandaged by a nurse. James, seated across from him, kept the conversation going, asking questions about Tyler's life. Most of Tyler's answers were vague, but James was patient, weaving through the boy's guarded responses. So, where do you sleep? James asked, trying to sound casual. Wherever I can, Tyler replied, his voice matter-of-fact. Sometimes under the bridge, sometimes in an alley. Doesn't really matter as long as it's dry. James's chest tightened. He had grown up in a comfortable home, had never known hunger or fear. The idea of this child living like that was unbearable. You shouldn't have to live like this, he said, his voice low. Tyler shrugged again, his expression unreadable. It's not so bad. You get used to it. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. No one should have to get used to that. You deserve better. Tyler. Tyler looked at him, startled by the conviction in his voice. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what better might look like: a warm bed, a full meal, someone to care about him. But he quickly pushed the thought away. Dreams like that only made reality harder to face. You don't even know me, he said quietly. Why do you care? James opened his mouth, then closed it, searching for the right words. Because you're worth caring about, he said finally. And because I think you might have just saved me in more ways than one. Tyler frowned, confused. What do you mean? James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I've been lost, too, Tyler. Not the way you've been, but, in my own way. I've been so focused on my work, on making money, that I forgot what it's like to really live. You reminded me. Tyler didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, as if he mattered. As if his actions had value. The nurse returned, handing Tyler a small pack of gauze and antiseptic cream. Take care of that arm, she said with a smile. Tyler nodded, slipping the items into his pocket. As they left the hospital, James turned to him. Do you have somewhere to go? Tyler hesitated, then shook his head. Not really. Then come with me, James said, his voice firm. Just for tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Tyler's instinct was to refuse. to insist he was fine on his own. But something in James's tone, a mixture of authority and genuine concern, made him pause. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And so, as the city lights flickered in the distance, two unlikely companions began a journey that neither of them could have anticipated, a journey that would change both their lives forever. The night air was cool and crisp as James drove through the quiet streets of Chicago. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, his body tense as his eyes darted around the sleek interior of the luxury car. He'd never been in a car like this before, one that smelled of leather and newness. One without scratches or stains or the faint odor of cigarettes. The seat beneath him felt like a cloud. But he didn't let himself relax. James glanced at the boy beside him, his small frame barely filling the seat. Tyler looked out the window, his expression guarded, as though he didn't want to admit how out of place he felt. "Do you like pizza?" James asked, breaking the silence. Tyler hesitated, unsure if the question was a trap. "Yeah, I guess." James smiled faintly. "There's a great place not far from here. Best deep dish in the city. How about we grab a couple of slices?" Tyler shrugged, though his stomach growled audibly at the suggestion. James caught the sound and chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a yes." Minutes later, they were seated in a small, cozy pizzeria. The smell of melted cheese and tomato sauce filled the air, and Tyler's eyes widened as the waitress placed a steaming slice in front of him. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of the unspoken rules of eating in a place like this. But the smell was too tempting, and he quickly dug in, his first bite eliciting a soft hum of satisfaction. James watched him with quiet amusement. "Slow down, kid. It's not going anywhere." Tyler paused, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But James's easy smile put him at ease. "Sorry," Tyler muttered. "It's just really good. Don't apologize." James said warmly, "Eat as much as you want." For the first time that evening, Tyler allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing as he polished off the slice. James ordered another, and they ate in companionable silence, the hum of conversation around them creating a bubble of normalcy that Tyler hadn't felt in years. When they left the pizzeria, Tyler was full and slightly sleepy. The warmth of the food settled in his belly, and for a moment, the weight of his world seemed lighter. James led him to the car, his steady presence both reassuring and unnerving. As they drove toward James's home, Tyler broke the silence. "Why are you being so nice to me?" James glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "Because you deserve it." Tyler snorted, the sound laced with disbelief. "Nobody does stuff like this for free." James sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Look, I won't pretend I understand what you've been through, but I know what it's like to feel lost. You helped me tonight, Tyler. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that people matter more than anything else. So yeah, I'm being nice. Not because I want something, but because I think you're worth it." Tyler didn't respond. He wasn't used to people talking to him this way, and he wasn't sure if he trusted it. But there was something in James's voice, an honesty that was hard to dismiss. They pulled up to a sprawling house with a manicured lawn and glowing lights in the windows. Tyler stared at it, his mouth slightly open. He'd seen places like this on TV, but he never imagined he'd step foot inside one. "Come on," James said, opening the door for him. "It's just for tonight. You can leave whenever you want." Tyler followed him inside, his bare feet padding softly on the polished hardwood floors. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the faint scent of lavender and cedar. James gestured for Tyler to sit on the couch while he disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he carried a first aid kit and a blanket. "Let's take care of that scrape," he said, sitting beside Tyler. Tyler flinched as James cleaned the wound, his hands surprisingly gentle. "You don't have to do this," Tyler said softly, watching as James applied a bandage. "I know," James replied, meeting his gaze. "But I want to." Tyler looked away, his chest tightening. He didn't know what to make of this man, this stranger who treated him with a kindness that felt almost foreign. When James finished, he handed Tyler the blanket. "You can sleep here," he said, gesturing to the couch. "There's a bathroom down the hall if you need it." Tyler nodded, clutching the blanket. "Thanks," he muttered. James smiled, standing up. "Good night, Tyler." As James walked away, Tyler called out, his voice hesitant. "Wait." James turned, his brow raised. "Yeah." Tyler fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You said I could ask for anything. As, like, repayment." James nodded, his expression serious. "Of course." Tyler took a deep breath, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Can you pretend to be my dad? Just for a day. I just want to know what it's like to have a dad." The room fell silent, the weight of Tyler's request hanging in the air. James stared at him, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. He crossed the room, kneeling in front of Tyler so they were eye level. "Yes," James said softly, "I'd be honored." Tyler's eyes filled with tears, though he quickly blinked them away. "Just for a day," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's all." James reached out, resting a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "For as long as you need, Tyler." And in that moment, something shifted between them, a connection forged not by blood, but by choice. A connection that would change them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of James Harrington's home, casting a warm glow over the living room where Tyler was still curled up on the couch. The soft hum of the city waking up outside was a stark contrast to the boys' usual mornings, which began with the chill of dawn and the clatter of garbage trucks. James stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee and glancing occasionally at Tyler. The boy looked so small, his face peaceful in sleep, the lines of worry and exhaustion temporarily smoothed away. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this same child had risked everything to save him. As the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, Tyler stirred, blinking sleepily as he pulled the blanket tighter around himself. His eyes widened in confusion for a moment, the unfamiliar surroundings throwing him off. But then the events of the previous day came rushing back. "You're awake," James said with a warm smile, stepping into the living room with a steaming mug in hand. "Morning." Tyler sat up, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I hope you like pancakes," James said, motioning toward the kitchen. "I figured we'd start the day right." Tyler hesitated. He wasn't used to being taken care of, and the idea of someone making breakfast for him felt strange. "You didn't have to," he said softly. But James waved him off. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "Besides, I'm not letting you go hungry on my watch." Tyler followed James into the kitchen, his bare feet padding quietly on the tile. The table was set with plates, syrup, and a small stack of pancakes that looked almost too perfect to eat. Tyler sat down cautiously, unsure of the etiquette for such a situation. James poured him a glass of orange juice. "Dig in," he said with an encouraging smile. Tyler picked up his fork and took a bite, his eyes widening as the warm, fluffy pancake melted in his mouth. "This is really good," he said, his voice filled with genuine surprise. James chuckled. "Glad you think so. It's been a while since I cooked for anyone other than myself." As they ate, James tried to learn more about Tyler. The boy was still guarded, offering short, vague answers. But James didn't push. He figured it would take time for Tyler to trust him, and he was willing to wait. After breakfast, James leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup in hand. "So, what's the plan for today?" he asked, his tone casual. Tyler hesitated, unsure if James was being serious. "You mean, I get to decide?" "Of course," James said. "It's your day." Tyler's mind raced. He didn't know what to ask for. His life had been so focused on survival that he had never really thought about what a fun day might look like. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice small. James studied him for a moment, then smiled. "How about we go to the amusement park? Ever been on a roller coaster?" Tyler's eyes lit up briefly before doubt clouded them. "I don't have any money," he said quietly. James shook his head. "You don't need any. Today's on me." An hour later, they were walking through the gates of the city's largest amusement park. The bright colors, the scent of cotton candy, and the sound of laughter surrounded them. And Tyler's expression shifted from cautious to awestruck. "This place is huge," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "It is," James agreed, smiling at the boy's reaction. "So, where to first?" Tyler scanned the rides, his gaze landing on a towering roller coaster in the center of the park. Its steel tracks twisted and turned against the sky, and the screams of its riders echoed in the air. He pointed to it, his excitement battling with a hint of fear. "That one." James raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's a big one to start with." Tyler nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'm sure." As they waited in line, Tyler fidgeted, his nervous energy palpable. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're gonna love it," he said. When it was their turn, Tyler climbed into the seat, gripping the safety bar so tightly his knuckles turned white. James sat beside him, offering a calm presence as the ride began its slow ascent. At the top, there was a moment of silence, the world stretching out before them. Then came the drop. Tyler screamed, his voice a mix of terror and exhilaration as the coaster hurtled down the track. James found himself laughing, caught up in the boy's sheer joy. When the ride ended, Tyler stumbled off, his legs shaky but his face lit with a grin. "That was amazing," he exclaimed. "Can we go again?" James laughed, ruffling his hair. "We've got the whole day ahead of us. Let's try something else first." They spent hours exploring the park, riding every roller coaster, playing games, and eating snacks. For Tyler, it was like stepping into another world, a world where he didn't have to worry about where his next meal would come from or where he'd sleep that night. As the sun began to set, casting the park in a warm golden light, they sat on a bench near the carousel. Tyler leaned back, his face flushed with happiness. "This is the best day I've ever had," he said softly. James felt a lump form in his throat. "You deserve more days like this." "Tyler," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve a lot more." Tyler looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude and something James couldn't quite place, hope. "Thanks for doing this," he said. "For everything." James nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "It's not over yet, kid. Let's see what else this park has to offer." And as they walked toward the next ride, James couldn't help but feel that this day wasn't just about giving Tyler a glimpse of a better life. It was about showing him and himself that sometimes family is found in the most unexpected places. The quiet hum of James's car accompanied them on their drive home from the amusement park. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, holding a stuffed bear he had won at one of the park's games. His face was lit with a soft glow, a mix of exhaustion and contentment. James glanced at him occasionally, his own heart warmed by the rare sight of joy on the boy's face. "Did you have fun?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Tyler turned to him, his smile shy but genuine. "Yeah, I think it was the best day I've ever had." James's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. It broke his heart that a simple day at an amusement park could mean so much to Tyler because it meant the boy hadn't had many good days at all. When they pulled into the driveway, the house stood tall and welcoming against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Tyler stepped out of the car, clutching the stuffed bear like a lifeline. As they entered the house, James flicked on the lights, illuminating the cozy living room. "You hungry?" James asked, heading toward the kitchen. Tyler shook his head. "Not really." James nodded, opening the fridge to grab a bottle of water. Let me know if you change your mind. There's plenty here. Tyler wandered into the living room, his fingers trailing along the edge of the couch as he took in the space. It still felt surreal to him. Being in a place like this, a place where he wasn't chased away or looked at like he didn't belong. As he sat down, he adjusted his jacket, and something small and metallic slipped from the inner pocket, landing on the coffee table with a soft clink. James, returning with his water, noticed the object immediately. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing to the shiny object. Tyler froze, his hand darting out to grab it. But James was quicker. He picked up the small silver locket and examined it, his brow furrowing as he opened it. Inside was a photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. James's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. He had memorized it, dreamt about it, searched for it. "Where did you get this?" James asked, his voice trembling. Tyler's eyes widened at the shift in James's tone. I didn't steal it. I swear," he stammered. "A lady gave it to me a few months ago. She said it would protect me." James sank onto the couch, his hands gripping the locket as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "This woman," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Where did you see her?" Tyler hesitated, unsure why James was reacting this way. "It was near the bridge where I sleep sometimes. She looked sick. But she was really nice. She gave me food and let me stay in a warm place for the night." James's chest tightened, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Tyler," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "This is Emily. My wife. She disappeared a year ago." Tyler's eyes widened in shock. "Your wife," he repeated. She's alive?" James nodded, his gaze fixed on the photograph. His mind raced with questions. Why had Emily disappeared? Why hadn't she come home? And where was she now? "She told me she was trying to start over," Tyler continued, his voice hesitant. "She said she had something important to protect. I didn't understand what she meant at the time." James looked up at him, his eyes brimming with desperation and hope. "Did she say where she was going? Anything that could help me find her?" Tyler shook his head. "No, but she mentioned something about a baby." The room fell silent. James stared at Tyler, the weight of the boy's words sinking in. A baby? Could Emily have been pregnant when she disappeared? If so, that meant... James stood abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. "I have to find her," he said, more to himself than to Tyler. "She's out there somewhere. And if she has a baby..." He turned to Tyler, his expression fierce but determined. "Thank you, Tyler. You've given me something I thought I'd never have again, hope." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do much. She's the one who helped me." James crossed the room and knelt in front of the boy, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You don't understand," he said firmly. "This locket, your story, it's more than I've had in months. It's a lifeline." Tyler nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. He couldn't fully grasp the depth of James's emotions, but he could see the pain and longing in the man's eyes. For the first time, Tyler felt like he was part of something bigger, something important. James stood, his jaw set with resolve. "I'm going to find her," he said. "And Tyler, I want you to stay here with me." Tyler blinked, surprised. "What? Why?" "Because I owe you," James said. "And because I think we could help each other. You gave me a chance to hope again. Tyler, let me give you a chance at a better life." Tyler looked down at the stuffed bear in his lap, his emotions a swirling mix of gratitude, fear, and confusion. No one had ever offered him something like this before, something real. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll stay." James smiled, relief washing over him. "Good. Now we'll figure this out together." And as the night deepened outside, the house seemed to grow warmer, filled with the unspoken promise of healing and new beginnings. For the first time in a long while, Both James and Tyler felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rewrite their stories and find the family they had both been searching for. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the wide windows of James's home, casting warm streaks of light across the living room floor. Tyler was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch with the stuffed bear by his side. His eyes followed James as the man paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, Margaret. It's her," James said, his voice tight with urgency. "The locket. The description, it all lines up. I need you to pull every file we have on missing persons and contact anyone who might know where she is." The person on the other end of the call said something, and James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's a long shot, but I have to try. Just keep me updated." When he hung up, James turned to find Tyler watching him. The boy's expression was unreadable, but his gaze carried the weight of unspoken questions. "Who's Margaret?" Tyler asked cautiously. "She's an investigator I've been working with," James explained, sitting down in the armchair across from Tyler. "I hired her months ago to help find Emily. She hasn't had much luck so far. But this," he held up the locket, his fingers brushing its surface. "This changes everything." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think she's okay? I mean, she looked sick when I saw her." James's jaw tightened. "I don't know. But if she's out there, I'll find her. I have to." The determination in his voice sent a shiver down Tyler's spine. He had seen James's focused intensity before. But this was different. This was personal. "I want to help," Tyler said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. James looked at him, his expression softening. "You already have, Tyler. You've done more than I could have ever hoped for." "No. I mean really help," Tyler insisted. "You can't do this alone. I know the streets, how people think, where they hide. I can show you." James hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his appreciation for Tyler's courage. "Tyler, it's dangerous. If Emily's been hiding, there's a reason for it. I can't risk putting you in harm's way." Tyler's small hands clenched into fists. "I'm not scared. And I'm not just some kid who doesn't know anything. I can help you. James. You have to let me." James sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're stubborn. You know that." Tyler managed a faint smile. "I've had to be." James couldn't argue with that. He leaned back, studying the boy who had already proven himself to be far braver than most adults he knew. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this my way. No taking risks. No wandering off." "Understood." Tyler nodded, his determination evident. "Understood." They spent the next few hours preparing. James pulled out a map of the city, marking the places Tyler mentioned, the bridge where he slept, the alleys where he'd seen Emily, and other locations where she might have sought refuge. Tyler watched, fascinated, as James's focus turned the chaotic sprawl of the city into a carefully organized plan. By midday, they were in the car, driving toward the part of town Tyler called home. The buildings grew shabbier as they neared the bridge, their once bright paint peeling and faded. Trash littered the sidewalks, and the air was heavy with the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. "This is it," Tyler said, pointing to a narrow alley near the bridge. "She was staying in a building back there." James parked the car, his heart pounding as they stepped out. He followed Tyler through the alley, the boy navigating the maze-like streets with the ease of someone who had spent years learning their secrets. They reached an abandoned building, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. Tyler hesitated at the entrance, glancing back at James. "She let me sleep in here once," he said softly. "It wasn't much, but it was warm." James nodded, his chest tightening at the thought of Emily staying in a place like this. "Let's look inside." The air inside the building was damp and cold. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boards, illuminating the dust that hung heavy in the air. Tyler led the way, his footsteps careful as he moved through the debris. She was in this room, Tyler said, stopping in what might have once been a living area. He gestured to a corner where a pile of old blankets and newspapers lay. She had a bag with her. It looked like it had clothes and stuff for the baby. James knelt by the blankets, his hands trembling slightly as he sifted through them. There was nothing there now, no bag, no belongings, but the faint imprint of someone's presence remained. She's been gone a while, James said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Tyler fidgeted, his face shadowed with guilt. I should have told someone when I saw her. James looked up, his expression softening. You didn't know, Tyler. You were just trying to survive. Don't blame yourself. Tyler nodded, though the weight of what he couldn't do still lingered in his eyes. Where do we go now? James stood, brushing the dust from his hands. We keep looking. Someone must have seen her. We'll ask around. And so they did. 4 hours. They walked through the neighborhood, stopping to speak with anyone who might have information. Most people shrugged them off, too wrapped up in their own struggles to care about a missing woman. But a few offered vague memories, a woman matching Emily's description seen near a shelter, or asking for food outside a grocery store. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, James and Tyler found themselves back at the car, exhausted but no closer to answers. I'm sorry, Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought this would help. James placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. It does help, Tyler. Every lead, every clue, it all brings us closer. We just have to keep going. Tyler looked up at him, his expression a mix of determination and doubt. Do you really think we'll find her? James's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with resolve. Yes. I don't know how long it'll take, but I won't stop until we do. And as they drove back home under the glow of the city lights, James silently vowed to keep his promise. For Emily. For Tyler. For the family he was determined to rebuild. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as James and Tyler returned home. The drive had been quiet, the weight of their fruitless search hanging heavy between them. James's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window, his stuffed bear tucked close to his chest. When they pulled into the driveway, Tyler finally broke the silence. Do you think we'll ever find her? He asked, his voice small and uncertain. James turned off the engine and exhaled deeply before responding. I do, he said firmly, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed his doubt. We're closer now than we've been in months. Tyler. Every clue we gather, every person we talk to, it's progress. Tyler nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He followed James into the house, the familiar warmth of the living room doing little to lift his spirits. James set down his keys on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge, pulling out a pitcher of water. Why don't you rest for a bit? James suggested, pouring a glass. We've had a long day. I'm not tired, Tyler replied, though the droop in his shoulders said otherwise. He sank onto the couch, the stuffed bear still clutched tightly in his hands. James sat down across from him, studying the boy's weary expression. Tyler. You've already done so much, he said gently. You've given me more hope than I've had in a year. Don't forget that. Tyler looked up at him, his eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. It's just, I feel like I should have done more, like I should have found a way to help her sooner. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Hey, listen to me. What you did, taking the locket, remembering her, telling me everything you could, it's more than anyone else has done. You don't need to carry this weight alone, Tyler. That's why we're in this together. For a moment, Tyler said nothing. Then, he nodded, his grip on the bear loosening slightly. Thanks, he murmured, his voice barely audible. The silence between them was interrupted by the ringing of James's phone. He quickly grabbed it from the counter, his heart leaping at the sight of Margaret's name on the screen. "Margaret," he answered, his voice taut with anticipation. "Please tell me you have something. I might." Margaret replied, her tone cautious but hopeful. "I reached out to a few shelters in the area Tyler mentioned. One of them reported a woman matching Emily's description who stayed there a couple of times. It's not much, but it's a start." James's pulse quickened. "Which shelter?" Margaret gave him the name and address, and James jotted it down on a notepad. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "This means everything to me." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret warned. "It's just a lead. But I'll keep digging." James hung up and turned to Tyler, his eyes alight with a renewed sense of purpose. "We've got a lead," he said. "A shelter downtown. She might have been there." Tyler sat up straighter, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "When do we go?" "First thing in the morning," James replied. "We need to be rested if we're going to follow this through." Tyler nodded, though his excitement made it clear he'd have trouble sleeping. "Do you think she'll still be there?" James hesitated, not wanting to give the boy false hope. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she's been there before, someone might know where she went." That night, as Tyler lay on the couch under the soft glow of the living room lamp, he clung to the thought of finding Emily, the woman who had shown him kindness when no one else had, the woman who had somehow connected him to James. He didn't know why he cared so much, why it felt so important to bring her home, but it did. In his room, James sat on the edge of his bed, the locket resting in his palm. He traced the outline of Emily's face, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. It had been so long since he'd last seen her, so long since he'd held her hand, heard her laugh, or shared in the simple joys of life together. "Where are you, Emily?" he whispered into the quiet night. "Why did you leave? And why didn't you come back?" The next morning, they set out early, the city still waking up as they drove downtown. The shelter was a nondescript brick building nestled between two larger ones, its faded sign barely visible from the street. James parked the car and turned to Tyler. "Stay close to me," he said, "and let me do the talking." Tyler nodded, though his curiosity buzzed under the surface. As they stepped inside, the smell of disinfectant and coffee greeted them. A woman behind the reception desk looked up, her tired eyes scanning them briefly before offering a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. James stepped forward, holding out the locket. "I'm looking for my wife," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "She's been missing for a year. Someone mentioned she might have stayed here." The woman's gaze flicked to the locket, her brow furrowing. "I think I remember her," she said slowly. "She didn't stay long. But she had a baby with her. She seemed scared." James's heart raced. "Do you know where she went?" The woman hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for the answer. "She mentioned heading toward another shelter," she said finally. "One on the south side. Said she needed to keep moving." James nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "You've helped more than you know." As they left the shelter, Tyler looked up at James, his eyes wide with hope. "Do you think we'll find her there?" James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We're one step closer, Tyler," he said, "and I won't stop until we find her." And with that, they set off again, driven by the faint glimmer of hope that Emily and the family they both longed for might finally be within reach. The south side of the city was a world away from the pristine suburbs where James lived. The streets were crowded with worn-out buildings and bustling sidewalks. Here, life moved with a raw intensity, unpolished and unrelenting. Tyler sat quietly in the passenger seat, his fingers nervously toying with the hem of his jacket as James navigated the unfamiliar streets. The shelter they were looking for came into view, a modest building with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Harbor Haven. It was tucked between a laundromat and a small convenience store. James parked and took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. You ready? He asked Tyler. His voice steady but strained. Tyler nodded, though he wasn't sure what to expect. Yeah. They stepped out of the car, the brisk morning air carrying the faint smell of gasoline and fried food. As they approached the shelter's entrance, James placed a reassuring hand on Tyler's shoulder. Let me do the talking, he reminded him gently. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but chaotic. The low hum of conversation and the occasional cry of a baby filled the air. People sat at worn tables, sipping coffee or sorting through donated clothing. Behind a counter, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor was organizing paperwork. James approached her, his heart pounding. Excuse me, he began, his voice calm but urgent. I'm looking for someone who might have stayed here recently. Her name is Emily Harrington. She has a baby. The woman glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. Emily, she repeated, her tone thoughtful. The name sounds familiar. Let me check our records. James nodded, grateful for even the possibility of progress. As the woman turned to a computer, Tyler stood by his side, his eyes darting nervously around the room. A few people looked their way, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I hope she remembers her, Tyler whispered. Me too, James replied, his voice low. He clenched the locket in his hand like a talisman, willing it to lead him closer to Emily. The woman returned after a few moments, a folder in her hand. She was here, she confirmed, her expression softening. About 3 weeks ago. She stayed for a few nights but left suddenly. Didn't say much, just that she couldn't stay in one place too long. James felt both relief and frustration. Did she say where she was going? The woman hesitated, then shook her head. No, but she mentioned needing to find a safer place for her baby. She seemed scared, paranoid, almost. James's chest tightened. The image of Emily alone, frightened, and constantly on the move was almost too much to bear. Do you know if she was in any kind of trouble? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't say for sure, the woman replied, but it seemed like she was running from something or someone. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside James. Did she leave anything behind? He asked, surprising both James and the woman with his question. The woman blinked, then frowned slightly. Actually, yes. She left a small bag in the storage room. We weren't sure if she'd come back for it. Could we see it? James asked quickly. She nodded and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, she returned with a faded canvas bag. James's hands trembled as he took it, unzipping it carefully. Inside were a few baby clothes, an old photograph, and a small notebook. The photograph caught his attention first, a candid shot of Emily laughing, her hair blowing in the wind. James's throat tightened as he traced the outline of her face. This is hers, he said softly, holding up the photo for Tyler to see. Tyler nodded, his expression somber. She gave me a bag like that once, with food inside. It looked just like this. James turned his attention to the notebook, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, though the entries were short and sporadic, filled with fragments of thoughts and observations. Safe for now, one entry read. Must keep moving. Can't let them find us. Another entry mentioned a park near the river, a place James recognized. His pulse quickened as he read the final note. If it's too dangerous, I'll go to St. Benedict's. St. Benedict's, James murmured. Do you know what that is? He asked the woman. She nodded. It's another shelter, but it's farther out, on the edge of the city. James thanked her profusely, his mind already racing ahead. Tyler followed him back to the car, his small frame barely keeping up with James's long strides. Do you think she's still there? Tyler asked as they climbed into the car. I don't know, James admitted, his voice tight with a mix of hope and fear. But we have to try. The drive to St. Benedict's was longer, the city gradually giving way to quieter streets lined with trees. Tyler leaned against the window. His thoughts a jumble of memories and emotions. He thought about the night Emily had helped him. Her soft voice and kind smile a rare comfort in his harsh world. He couldn't imagine what she was running from or why, but he knew she didn't deserve to face it alone. When they arrived, St. Benedict's looked more like a church than a shelter. Its stone facade was weathered but sturdy, and the stained glass windows glinted in the late afternoon sun. James parked the car and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "This could be it," he said quietly. "We could find her here." Tyler nodded, his heart pounding. "Let's go." As they stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy with anticipation. James gripped the locket in his pocket, silently praying that this fragile trail would finally lead him to Emily and to the answers they both so desperately needed. The stone path leading to St. Benedict's felt endless, every step charged with hope and trepidation. James walked ahead, his shoulders tense, while Tyler trailed slightly behind, clutching the stuffed bear he had brought with him. The imposing shelter loomed larger as they approached, its towering archways both welcoming and ominous. Tyler glanced at James, noticing how his hand remained firmly in his pocket, fingers curled around the locket like a lifeline. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, greeted them warmly as they entered. Behind her, the sound of laughter echoed faintly, a group of children playing in a nearby room. Despite the noise, the place exuded an air of peace. "Welcome to St. Benedict's. How can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice calm and measured. James cleared his throat, stepping closer to the counter. "I'm looking for my wife," he began, pulling the photograph from Emily's bag. "She may have been here recently. Her name is Emily Harrington, and she has a baby." The woman took the photograph, her brows furrowing in concentration as she studied it. "I do recognize her," she said after a moment. "She came here about 2 weeks ago. Stayed for a few nights but left in a hurry." James exhaled, a mixture of relief and frustration. "Did she say where she was going?" The woman shook her head. "No, but she seemed distraught. It was clear she was running from something. We tried to get her to stay longer, but she insisted she couldn't risk it." Tyler stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "Did she say anything about the baby? Was he okay?" The woman's expression softened as she looked at Tyler. "The baby was fine. As far as we could tell. She was very protective of him, made sure he was warm and fed. She didn't talk much, though." James felt a pang of guilt. Emily had been through so much, yet he hadn't been there to protect her. He glanced at the receptionist, his voice tinged with desperation. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone? Anyone she spoke to? Anything she left behind?" The woman hesitated, then motioned for them to follow her. "She didn't leave much, but we keep a log of visitors. Maybe it will help." James and Tyler followed her down a narrow hallway lined with bulletin boards covered in flyers and notes. At the end of the hall was a small office, its walls lined with filing cabinets. The receptionist pulled out a large ledger and flipped through the pages until she found the entry. She signed in under her name, Emily Harrington, the woman said, pointing to the log. "And here," she wrote a note when she left. "Heading east. Thank you for everything." That's all it says. James frowned. "East? That could mean anything." The woman nodded sympathetically. "I know it's not much, but maybe it'll help narrow things down." James thanked her, his mind already racing. As they made their way back to the car, Tyler broke the silence. "Do you think she's safe?" James glanced down at the boy, his expression softening. "I don't know, Tyler," he admitted. "But knowing she was here and that she's still moving, it's a good sign." They climbed back into the car, and James unfolded the map he had brought. "If she's heading east, that puts her near the edge of the city," he mused aloud. "There are fewer shelters out there, but she might be looking for someplace more remote." Tyler watched him, his brow furrowed. "Do you think she's running from someone? Like, someone dangerous?" James hesitated, the thought chilling him. It's possible. But until we find her, we can't know for sure. The drive eastward was quiet, the weight of unanswered questions heavy between them. Tyler stared out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the night he'd met Emily. She'd seemed so strong, despite her circumstances. But now he wondered how much of that strength was a mask to protect herself and her baby. After an hour of driving, James pulled into the parking lot of another small shelter. This one was less welcoming, its exterior plain and unadorned. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, more somber. A man behind the desk looked up as they entered, his sharp eyes immediately assessing them. "Can I help you?" he asked. James approached, holding out Emily's photo once more. "I'm looking for my wife," he said, his voice steady. "She's been missing for a year. Someone said she might be heading east. Have you seen her?" The man studied the photograph, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. "She was here. Stayed for one night about a week ago. Didn't say much. But she looked like she'd been through hell." James's stomach clenched. "Did she tell you where she was going?" "No," the man replied. "But she asked about nearby places, somewhere quiet. Out of the way. I told her about an old farm that sometimes takes in people who need help." "A farm?" James repeated, hope flickering in his chest. "Do you know where it is?" The man scribbled something on a scrap of paper and handed it to James. "It's a bit of a drive. But if she's looking to stay off the radar, it's as good a place as any." James thanked him, his grip on the paper tightening as he and Tyler returned to the car. As they set off again, the weight of the journey felt heavier than ever. But the possibility of finding Emily and finally bringing her home kept them going. Tyler glanced at James, his voice tentative. "Do you think she's still there?" James didn't look away from the road, but his expression was resolute. "I don't know," he said. "But if she is, we'll bring her home. I promise." The car sped toward the farm, the fading light casting long shadows across the road. For the first time, they felt like they were nearing the end of their search and the beginning of something new. The road to the farm stretched out ahead of them, winding through rolling hills and open fields bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Tyler sat upright in his seat, his small hands gripping the edge of the door as he peered out the window. James glanced at him, his expression softening despite the tension in his chest. "It's not far now," James said, his voice steady but tinged with anticipation. The directions scribbled on the scrap of paper were clear enough. But the closer they got, the more his nerves tightened. "What if she's not there?" Tyler asked quietly, almost as if he didn't want to voice the fear that had been gnawing at him. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "Then we keep looking," he said firmly. "We're not giving up." The car turned onto a dirt road lined with trees whose bare branches reached toward the darkening sky like skeletal hands. In the distance, a modest farmhouse came into view, its windows glowing softly with warm light. A barn stood nearby, its weathered wood illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. James parked the car near the house and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Tyler moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken hopes and fears. Finally, James took a deep breath and opened his door. "Stay close," he said to Tyler as they stepped out onto the gravel driveway. Tyler nodded, clutching his stuffed bear tightly as he followed James to the front door. The wooden steps creaked beneath their weight, and James knocked lightly. The sound echoed through the still evening air. They waited, each passing second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the door opened, revealing a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. James held up the photograph of Emily, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm looking for my wife," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "She's been missing for a year. Someone said she might have come here." The woman took the photograph, studying it closely. Her brow furrowed. And she glanced back toward the interior of the house. "She's here," she said finally. Her words almost a whisper. James's breath caught in his throat. Tyler's eyes widened. And he clutched James's arm tightly. "She's here," James repeated, barely able to believe the words. The woman nodded. "She arrived a few days ago with her baby. She's been staying in the guest room. But she's fragile." James felt a surge of relief, hope, and anxiety all at once. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking to Tyler. "She's been through a lot. You'll need to go gently." James nodded, his heart pounding as the woman stepped aside to let them in. The house was cozy, with the scent of wood smoke and baked bread lingering in the air. Tyler stayed close to James, his steps tentative as they followed the woman down a narrow hallway. She stopped in front of a closed door and knocked softly. "Emily, you have visitors," she said gently. There was a long pause before a faint voice answered. "Come in." The woman opened the door, and James stepped inside, his breath catching at the sight before him. Emily sat in a worn armchair by the window, cradling a baby in her arms. Her hair was longer and wilder than he remembered, and her face was pale. But her eyes, those familiar, striking eyes, met his with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's me," he said, his voice breaking. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. "Emily, I've been looking for you. For so long." Tears welled in her eyes as she gazed at him, then at Tyler, who stood just inside the doorway, clutching his bear. "You found me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't think anyone would." James knelt in front of her, his hands reaching for hers but stopping just short. "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice filled with pain and longing. "Why didn't you come back?" Emily's gaze dropped to the baby in her arms. "I was scared," she said softly. "There were things happening. Things I didn't know how to face. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." James's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "You don't have to protect me," he said. "You don't have to do this alone. You never did." Tyler took a tentative step forward, his small voice breaking the silence. "Miss Emily," he said. "Do you remember me?" Emily looked at him, her expression softening. "Of course I do," she said. "You were the brave boy who found me when I needed help." Tyler smiled shyly, his grip on the bear loosening. "James and I worked together to find you," he said. "We're a team." Emily's gaze shifted back to James, her eyes brimming with gratitude and something deeper. "You brought him into your life?" she asked, her voice trembling. James nodded. "He brought us together," he said. "And he's part of our family now." Emily's tears spilled over as she reached out, her free hand finding James's. For the first time in a year, she felt a flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever, hope. As the baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft cry, James placed a hand on his tiny head, his heart swelling with love and determination. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to face everything together." And in that moment, as the fractured pieces of their lives began to mend, James, Emily, Tyler, and the baby took their first steps toward healing, toward becoming the family they were always meant to be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse radiated a quiet warmth, its rooms filled with laughter, tears, and hope. James, Emily, Tyler, and the baby sat together for the first time as a family, a sense of peace settling over them after months of searching and uncertainty. The journey that had brought them here was one of courage, resilience, and love, a testament to the strength found in unlikely bonds. Emily held the baby close, her gaze meeting James's with gratitude and a newfound sense of belonging. Tyler, nestled beside them, felt the security of a family he had longed for his entire life. Together, they knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, But they also knew they would face them as one. The light from the farmhouse glowed softly into the night, a beacon of hope and new beginnings. Life had tested them, but in their struggles, they discovered the true meaning of family, a connection that transcended fear and uncertainty, built on trust and unconditional love. If you found this story moving, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories. Your support helps us bring tales of hope, perseverance, and love to life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.